A very warm welcome to our underground studio at the Swedish Defence University. My name's Robert Egnell, Professor of Leadership and the Vice Chancellor of the university. It's an absolutely wonderful day out there, but at the same time we meet under rather grim circumstances. A global pandemic, what is often described as an ever-worsening security situation with global leaders behaving in ways that are with less useful agendas, one could summarize it as, perhaps. We meet here at the Swedish Defence University, which obviously is the place to discuss these issues, but also the place where we prepare our students, military and civilian, for leadership roles within the security sector. We also take great pride in being a meeting place between people of different backgrounds and with different perspectives, military and civilian, theory and practice, professional and academic. And given the grim circumstances, but also the meeting place ambitions, it gives me great joy to introduce our guest today, Dan Smith. You are most welcome. You are the director of SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, but you also have decades of experience working on issues of peace building, peace and war, conflict resolution, climate and security, etc., etc. And you have it from different perspectives: research, policy, practice, within the university world, think tanks, international organizations, and NGOs. It is a great pleasure to have you here, and you are most welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Robert. Thank you.
I'd like to step back a little bit to my little introduction about the ever-worsening security situation, because that's the beginning of a lot of conversations these days, or the beginning of a lot of discussions on consequences of that. And that gives us sort of perhaps falsely an idea that there's a consensus regarding this worsening security situation. But what do we actually mean when we say that? What does it entail? What are the threats we're talking about? And how can we tackle them? My sense is that our consensus isn't that great. So therefore, I'd like to ask you to start out by giving your perspective on this. In what kind of a situation do we find ourselves? What are the greatest challenges?
Well, I think that the way that I look at this would start from looking at global level indicators. So military spending now stands at about 1.9 trillion US dollars. That's the highest that it's been since 1988, which was just before the end of the Cold War, in other words. And you could make any argument which you'd like about any of the national components of that global total of 1.9 trillion. But if the world is spending that much on military preparations, it seems that at least leaders in the world think that there is either something to fear or some advantage to gain, which is expressed through that figure. The number of wars has increased over this last decade. The trend approximately was 1990, at the end of the Cold War, about 50 armed conflicts going on. Mid-1990s, more than that. Figures vary according to definition, but maybe 60. And then a steady decline until about 2007, 2008, when it bottomed out. In 2010, you have about 30 armed conflicts going on. And now we're back to 50. So you can see a period when the global zone of peace expanded, and in the last decade it has shrunk. Similar other figures that one could take, other indicators, the arms trade. Arms transfers are continuing steadily to increase across this period. So all of these indicators suggest the world is not in a very good condition. And then you look more closely into geopolitical relations and you see growing tensions there. People are now talking about a new Cold War between the US and China. Personally, I think that to use that terminology is a bit misleading because it suggests parallels that don't really exist with the Cold War between the US and the USSR. So I think we need a different vocabulary, but there is something bad happening in international relations there. And relations between the West in general and Russia are also clearly very difficult, and in Europe, including in our corner of Europe and the Baltic region, but also further south for the Ukraine and so on. Evidently, there are tensions and hostilities, confrontations, risks of danger. That's just to talk about the security sector. But starting from there, I would say that, to sum up, after a couple of decades of gain, we have had a decade of deterioration.
Right. And there's a long list of issues you're talking about, and I would therefore like to force you to answer a rather gimmicky question. And it stems from a talk I heard William Hague give at Georgetown a number of years back, where he said the greatest strategic prize of the 21st century is ... because I won't give you his answer. But I thought it was an interesting idea to force you to answer what is the one issue, if you had to pick one issue to resolve this century for mankind, which one would it be? What is the greatest strategic prize of this century?
Oh, I think I'm pretty clear about that. Humanity has completely messed up its relationship with nature. And if we don't get that, let me not say straight, but if we don't make it better, if we don't have a less messed up relationship with nature, then the ground beneath our feet is not just going to be shifting, it's going to be crumbling away. I mean, we're living in a world now where we think that about half the population of the world will be facing water scarcity during this decade of the 2020s. We see on current trends that average global temperatures will increase well ahead of the targets which have been set through international agreement with the Paris Climate Change Agreement 5 years ago. If that happens, just to take one sort of example to think this through a bit, sea level will rise. And the biggest worry for that is not just to do with actual sort of permanent flooding of areas or submerging of them. It's sea level surge that will create repetitive floods which make living on coastal plains very, very difficult. On coastal plains within 5 meters of sea level, there live about 1 billion people worldwide. So this is the kind of strategic issue that we will be facing if we are unable to improve our relationship with nature. And that's only to talk about that dimension of it. I mean, we could also be talking about the pandemics. We could also be talking about the crisis of air pollution. We can be talking about the catastrophic loss of biodiversity. More species are being extinguished now than at any time in the either human history or the archaeological record. Right? So this is the one thing. All of the other things that we might think about, human rights, democracy, greater prosperity for all on a more equal basis, gender equality, equality between the races and the ethnic groups, tolerance, living dignified lives. All of these rest in the end on our relationship with nature, which we have got wrong, and we've got to try and get it a bit more right.
And for this audience, which partly will contain a lot of, I should call it, traditional security thinkers who focus on international relations, on military threats and the risk of war, and who are seeing, again, an ever-worsening security situation globally in terms of international relations, but also then a behavior of our eastern neighbor in our neighborhood that is really worrying. You still think that they should worry about climate security and pandemics, etc.? What kind of linkages can you draw there?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, because I will draw a slightly different picture from yours. Yes, our eastern neighbor is problematic, but look also at South Asia and the geopolitical situation between India and Pakistan, also at the Middle East, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran with the international players involved there. So it is not just about a threatening power. It is about a deteriorated situation worldwide. And the first thing to say to the sort of the hard security audience is that you have to, at some level, look above the immediate horizon and think more broadly, more long term. But the second thing then to say is that, do you remember 2015 and what was called the refugee crisis, as 1.5 million refugees came into Europe, and Europe didn't really know how to handle that. Right? The population of the small island states that face total inundation within a 10 to 20 year period is approximately 2.3 million people. So we're already talking well above the refugee, as we called it at the time, crisis. Right? But then relate that to the figure which I just mentioned of a global population of 1 billion living in low-lying coastal plains. Then add in other pressures, whether they're from Afghanistan or in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel, not all driven by climate change, but in many ways connected, exacerbated with climate change. If we are not able to address these issues, we will have a security agenda for, as we say, the traditional security folk, a security agenda in the late 2020s, 2030s, and into the 2040s, which is essentially unmanageable.
Yeah. So we can see then a clear link between climate issues and other of the global non-antagonistic problems that we're facing and resulting really hard security issues and vice versa, obviously, because these global conditions are worsened if there is conflict, or the ability of societies to tackle an earthquake or rising sea levels.
I don't know if this is jumping the gun in terms of the way you've thought of the conversation, but you've raised immediately for me one of the things which is at the core of thinking about security in the future, which is that if we're thinking about issues like climate change and the interaction between that and other problems, social inequalities, international conflict, and so on, of creating security problems, what we need in order to be able to address those issues is cooperation. It is not really realistic to think that even the most powerful, richest, and most populous states can resolve any of these big global issues by themselves. Acting alone is not a realistic way to achieve the solution. So we have to get better at cooperation. And that, I think, is the real kind of, well, I hesitate to say tragedy, but this is the kind of the really difficult paradox of our time, that we can see more and more clearly a deeper and wider ranging need for cooperation at the same time as there appears to be a declining appetite for international cooperation amongst some of the big powers and some of the smaller ones as well. And that's what we really need to address. Cooperating both towards resolving those fundamental environmental problems long term, and in the short to medium term, figuring out ways to ride out the difficulties that there will inevitably be. Cooperation is the key to it.
So I would just like to address the audience and say that there's an opportunity to ask questions throughout this conversation. So if you want to break in and ask a very good question, I will see that on my iPad on the table. Otherwise, we will save also time for questions towards the end. We're getting into the solutions bit, and that's really important. And you mentioned cooperation, and well, another trend that goes in the opposite direction. So why are we seeing that? We can summarize, I guess, your argument as global issues require global solutions.
Yes.
And not even the greatest superpower, the only remaining superpower, can tackle migration, climate change, terrorism, international
cyber vulnerability,
precisely pandemic. The whole list of issues on their own. At the same time, we're seeing something that one could describe then as a nationalization of the security agenda, where we're again trying to strengthen the national ability to tackle security issues. Where does this come from, you think? Why are we seeing these at odds trends?
Well, let's begin by making a blatantly political point. Okay, if you look at the US, Russia, UK, and Brazil, you see these very nationalistic leaders, right? And you see that that sort of sense of, make America great, or Britain going it alone, coming to the forefront, the Russian version and the Brazilian version. What do you also see? These are 4 countries you would pick out as really having handled the pandemic badly. So I think the first thing to say is that kind of populist nationalism may be good for campaigning, but it doesn't seem to work at running government in the best possible way. Now, where does it come from? I think that's really interesting, and I don't really know enough about the kind of, the social conditions and the political circumstances in each country to talk about it with any degree of authority. But my guess, partly based on what I know about the sort of the electoral patterns in the US, and certainly based on what I know about my own country, the UK, and the Brexit vote, it is fundamentally people who feel left behind by what has been experienced as progress in the late 20th and early 21st century. It's those people who, casting around for solutions, have at the moment opted for a kind of populism, because they have seen an elite, a cosmopolitan, metropolitan elite, which talks a language that very often cares about them. I mean, the words inclusivity and equality and everything nice gets talked about. But then in that what used to be a mining village, since the mine closed in the mid-1980s, nothing has moved. Nothing has moved forward. You go back there now, 30, 35 years after the mines have closed, and there's no new opportunities have come. So the only question would be, well, could people move? But certainly in the UK, it can be very difficult to move to the areas of the country where there's more opportunity, because your house in County Durham is worth X, but to get somewhere in the southeast of England to be getting a job in the areas of prosperity, you need 10 times X. So you're kind of economically trapped by the system, and you don't see or feel that anybody is really helping, and then you vote against. I mean, I think that, that is where you have to say, well, that's where the anti-EU membership campaign in the UK was really quite brilliant, because it tapped so neatly into this vein of resentment and aligned that with a kind of traditionalism that had always been there. And, British have always been a bit suspicious of foreigners, as you probably know. And those two things came neatly together. So I don't know how it is in the other countries as to why there's been that kind of opting but for that kind of solution. But one has seen in many other countries that sort of sense that the current political order is not delivering, so let's change it. And that doesn't always result in seemingly the best decisions and the best outcomes at government level.
Right. Well, yes, there are winners and losers in every country, obviously, and then there's the middle class. And I think the polarization that we're seeing globally and nationally, it has different reasons depending on where you are, but we're seeing different types of polarization happening. And of course, that middle part, the sort of those who are content with society decreasing and increasing the number of winners and losers out there. And that perhaps creates this resentment. And
I think, from your or my relatively comfortable situations, we might judge a potential candidate for government on the basis of, well, how well is this going to deliver this, and this at the international level? Is this going to be somebody who, works well within the EU context? Is this somebody who's going to really help grease the wheels of international trade so that it runs smoothly? Is this somebody who's going to help get international agreement on the environment? But there are many people who are thinking with a completely different calculus because they need to. Is this somebody who's going to help me get my life moving? So I think you simply cannot ignore social difference and class difference when thinking about what the outcomes are in policy terms. So as well as thinking about cooperation at the international level, therefore, we need to be thinking about, well, what kinds of societies are most conducive towards that cooperation at the international level. And I think that the polarization and the kind of the you know, the shouty nature of politics and the completely confrontational, just shouting slogans at each other, the lack of civility that a lot of people are identifying in political debate and discourse in these years. I think this is all part of the issue that we're discussing.
That's right. I found it very interesting when an American politician before the last midterm elections was faced with, well, it was in the midst of a discussion on crime and disorder within the United States, and he explained, you know, the worsening situation, and the reporter said, well, actually, statistics tell a completely different story, and his reply was, well, actually, I'm a politician, so it's not about the statistics, it's about how people feel, and my job is to tackle the issues that people care about and how they feel, rather than some statistics on a piece of paper, which to me is obviously the very core of populism, to think that way. But it's also quite interesting, and it leads me back to the view of global security, because we have thinkers like Steven Pinker and Josh Goldstein who are trying through data to show a completely different story, and to argue that while we might feel insecure and that we live in in very dangerous times, that actually we have never been healthier, lived longer, been richer, safer, etc., etc. Are they wrong, or how do you view this argument?
I think it's a little bit, or more than a little bit, to do with the framework in which you put this, and sometimes the time perspective. So if you look at this decade and compare it to the period from 1995 to 2010, you'd have to say, oh, you know, this is just rubbish. They're just wrong. Things are worse now than they were 15 years ago. But if you look at the time frame which they're actually discussing, which is of centuries, then they're right in lots of ways. And it is true. I mean, we are healthier, we live longer lives, but it's not only that. I mean, human rights are respected and acknowledged now in ways that were unthinkable 150 years ago. The kind of criticism that is now made about abuse of human rights, you know, it's sort of 150 years ago, people would have said, well, you're living in dreamland and you still find problems with it, right? And casualties of war. I mean, yes, the first 2 decades of the 20th century have seen, you know, Darfur and Iraq and Afghanistan and above all Syria and also Yemen. But compare that to the first 2 decades of the 21st century with the First World War and colonialism. If you only took essentially genocide in Belgian Congo and added that to the First World War, that atrocious statistics of death. And we're not living in that world now. So Pinker and Goldstein and the sort of school of thought are right about that. But if you change the frame slightly again, right, and you start to think about the environmental issues,
right,
then you start to see that, yes, we are doing quite well in lots of ways, but we are doing so on the basis of an economic system which is essentially eating us slowly. It's nibbling away at the ground beneath our feet, and eventually, if nothing else happens, we're going to crash through the holes which are created, and we have to stop that. So I think that they're right about the gains, but they haven't taken account of the risks that are being created in the process of making the gains. And that's the problem that we have, and it's the problem for addressing climate change and other environmental issues, is that those risks and problems are created by not at the margins of our economic system, but by the core functioning of our economics today. And so that's what really needs to be closely addressed. Right.
So there's really a factor completely missing in the analysis.
Yes, I think so. And I think all the time when one, you know, as director of SIPRI, I'm very, very committed to the evidence. We must get the evidence, and we must put every bit of effort that we can into getting that evidence straight. But once you have got the evidence, it doesn't tell you the whole story. I mean, the military spending data tell us the story about military spending. They don't tell us the story about everything, not even in the security sector. So you have to contextualize all the time. And I think that that's right. What that sort of more, that the optimistic school of thought about war and peace has got a lot of things right, but it's missed a big part of the global context.
Yes. Well, thanks a lot for that excellent analysis. You've already given us an answer to part of this question, but when we tackle all of these issues that we are talking about here today, what are the most important factors? You talked about cooperation. Are there other factors that are key that you'd like to?
Well, I think if you think about the pandemic, right, one of the things which it has shown is the deficient resilience of our societies. Mm-hmm. If you think about the risks associated with cyber vulnerability, again, one is thinking about a kind of a fragility in society. You know, I mean, some serious hacking by a few hundred people can bring a whole country to a standstill. If you think about climate change and the pressures of that and the loss of biodiversity and others of those kinds of issues. Again, we're thinking about this issue of being resilient against all of these pressures. And if you think about just handle the thought that the arrival of 1.5 million people into an area where, I don't know what the population of Europe is now, is it about 400 and something million people? But I mean, 1.5 million people coming was a very low percentage compared to the population as well. It's a very small proportion. And we thought of that as a crisis, and it was all unmanageable and so on. Right. So I think, again, there's an issue of resilience there. So if one is thinking about building resilience, if you think about it in different sectors, the environment, computers and IT, security, to do with resilience against the effects of having a conflict in a neighboring country. If you think of all of those things, you may think different factors and different kinds of preparation. But as I've said, I like to think at the global level, and I see what unites all of these different sectors. And I think it's just two factors. One which I've mentioned already, which is cooperation, and the other one is knowledge. Mm-hmm. We need to know, we need to understand about how to receive information, even unwelcome information, even unfamiliar information, process it, share it, discuss it, come to conclusions, act upon it, and then see what effect we're having and start the whole discussion over again. And that needs to be the case whether you're thinking about the United Nations handling this at a global level, or the European Union or the African Union handling it at regional levels, or government, or provinces, or towns, or even families, right? All the way through. It's, can you handle knowledge and can you work together?
I like that idea of knowledge.
Well, you're in the knowledge game as well as I am, so of course we like knowledge.
You have tremendous knowledge of international organizations, and I guess we've grown used to the liberal idea that what we cannot tackle at national levels, or what the anarchic international system cannot do for us, we have international organizations for that creates an order, some form of stability. But what's the state of affairs in our international organizations these days? Is the UN, NATO, the regional organizations, the EU, are they up to the task?
Well, they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses, don't they? I mean, one part of it I think with any international organization is that it is very difficult for it to rise above the flaws and the weaknesses, or indeed, the preferences of the member states within it. So the United Nations can express the best that is possible, but can it express better than that? Can it, really surmount the flawed nature of governments and their relations with each other, and their misunderstandings and their misperceptions and their need to gain prestige out of everything and so on. So that's one part of it. I think then that these organizations are very, very complex things. I mean, I wrote a book about NATO about a long time ago. I won't say how long ago. That's embarrassingly long time ago. And I looked for an organizational chart. And I swear that the only kind of legible way to produce an organizational chart would have been to put it on a wall about as big as the one that we see in this room. At that time, there were 625 committees and subcommittees of the organization. Right. I have no idea how many there are if you take the UN. But, you know, it's 30 agencies, and some of these agencies are enormous. The World Food Programme is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. This is employing thousands of people, headquarters all around the place. In such big organizations, EU, African Union as well, along with them, you also get, inevitably, some kind of bureaucratic ossification is going to happen from time to time, organizational inertia taking over. Sometimes this can then be expressed in the quality of individuals being appointed to senior positions, that they are ones who are able to either run the organizational issues and or play the bureaucratic game, but sometimes not really find the way to express the real vision of the organization and the dynamism with which it should have been operating. And then you find that some can. And you look into many of these organizations and you find people who are indeed, you know, despite everything, still passionate. And I mean, there's this old joke, I think it was originally made about the UN, but it's probably, no, the EU, I'm sorry, it was the Bellemont building in Brussels. But it may well have been made about any organization. You know, it's a stranger coming along and saying, how many people work here? And the answer is, oh, about half. But the thing is that those half are working 3 times as hard as they ought to be, and 3 times as productively, right? So there, you know, you do also have that energy within the organization. I think at the moment we are in a bad phase because of the kind of leadership we see, which you referred to right at the beginning in your introductory comments, which I've referred to when thinking about populism and, you know, one nation coming first kind of approach to international politics. So I think we are in a difficult situation now, which I think is made worse or made more complicated by another structural question, which is that regardless of which individuals would be leading these powers, there is a shift in world power going on. Right? So, I mean, China is distinctly a rising power, and while the US is not yet a declining power, relatively speaking, its position is less strong against China than it was. It's still spending way, way more on the military and has a much more larger and more, I mean, a much more capable military establishment. But China's military spending has been increasing, I think, every year for the past 2 decades. So these shifts in world power are real. And whether you welcome that or not, put that to one side. So put the kind of the value assessment of it to one side. Change is unsettling.
Right.
And so you have all of this. You have the international organizations with their strengths and their weaknesses. You have the rising pressures of the challenges from the environment, cyber vulnerability, and so on. You have a structural change in global power dynamics going on. And you have the question of what I think is quite deficient leadership of some of the great powers for addressing those global questions. And that altogether makes for a difficult situation. But I would say it's not, you know, things can change quite quickly. Leaders can change, organizations can change, issues can develop very fast. And I think that, for example, on the environmental issue, which I see as being the number one issue of our age in many ways, you also have so much energy and so much awareness, so much knowledge now going into this, that we're beginning to get a very clear sense of what the solutions can be. And if you have that sense of what the solutions could be, then you have a chance to actually be implementing them.
The topic of international organizations and international corporations got the audience going as well. And there's a couple of very good questions here. One is whether we should develop international cooperation within the current structure and the organizations that we have them, the UN, that's what we've got, as we quite often say, or whether it's time to develop something new and to seek to create a new kind of international system, new organizations. What role will the UN play in the future? Another one is more specific, and that is on the effects of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons if it becomes international law. So those are, within this topic, I think, something...
Well, I think on the first question, there's a kind of dilemma there, because the more that you recognize what the difficulties are within the present system, perhaps on the one hand, the more impatient you get and think, do away with it. We need something new. Right? But the more you also have to think, well, those leaders and that tone of international relations, which are the problem that we see, do we think they can be the source of a solution? Right? Because they are the ones who would have to do the voting and the decision making to close down what does exist and create something new. And I guess I would fear that they might agree on the closing down, but not on the creating of something new.
Right.
So the present international order was really created out of two enormous moments of destructiveness. One was the First World War, which led to the movement to outlaw war, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And that has been much despised by students of international relations for the past many years. But it's actually the basis for saying that a war of aggression is illegal. And it's, in many ways, it's the basis for a complete change in attitudes towards war, towards thinking of it as, perhaps sometimes a necessary evil, but not as a glorious enterprise. And then the second one, of course, was the Second World War, out of which was created the United Nations. And I certainly would not wish either catastrophe on the world again in order to create a new system. So I think we've got to make do with what we've got and adjust it as well as we possibly can.
We've also become very used to the idea of the United States as a world leader. I guess both ideologically, but also in real terms with the economic and military power that they have. Do you think that, and this is also a question from the audience, do you think that the US will ever play that role again, or is the race lost?
I think in the way that we have seen it, I think that's probably very likely to be over. I think that a different administration taking a different tack from the current US administration, whether that comes about through elections in November 2020 or November 2024, I think that could change things. That could bring about a US that was more favorably regarded by international partners. But I fear that something kind of quite fundamental, some fundamental piece of damage which has been done, which is, can you really fundamentally place your trust in an American signature on a treaty and even its ratification by Congress? If it's possible to regard agreements like the JCPOA, the Iran-US nuclear deal, or the Paris Climate Change Agreement, if it's possible to regard America's adherence to those as being, that was the previous president, therefore we don't regard ourselves as being bound by it. If one president can do that, can other presidents not also do that? I think that it's been assumed that once treaties were signed, they were going to be respected. They were going to be lived by. If that's no longer true, then I think that there will be a different attitude towards the US. I think it remains true for most of the rest of the world. There may be some individual states, and the powerful states always have always wanted. I mean, this is effectively a law of nature, right? They always want to take a selective attitude, a selective approach towards international law and their obligations. And there's always a lot of double standards from the great and the most powerful. One should never be surprised by that. But I think that it's gone just that bit further. And I think it has done some serious damage. So I'm not sure that the US will get back that ideological leadership that it has had in the past. And the economic situation, it will remain an economic superpower for as far ahead as I can see. But it is very different with China's economic growth of the past 3 decades. The world has already changed as far as that is concerned. By some measures, China already has a larger economy, and by most measures, it will have by 7 or 8 years from now.
Right. We've been touching upon leadership and bad leadership from some of the presidents and prime ministers of the world, and without forcing you to grade the world leaders around us, are there any personality traits or general ideas about leadership that you would like to see in our future presidents and prime ministers globally?
I think humility is a good thing. I think in general terms, honesty is good. I think that respect for the facts is an important part of it. I think that respect for other people as individuals, but also for large groups, respect on a kind of generic sense as well as an individual sense. I think these are important qualities. I think that the leaders that I feel most sort of admiration for, and I'm pleased that you're not going to force me to grade them or name them, but they're very often people whom I feel at least are really grounded, you know, in a sort of in a reality, in a life experience of their own, so that they have their own they have their own hinterland, right? And that allows them then to have the humility. It means they don't have to have the fragile egos and the easily punctured pride, which means that you have to stand on your prestige the entire time and be in the front row of the photograph, and so on. So I think that those actually, in one way, I think that the qualities which we really like when we find them in our friends and our neighbors and so on are the qualities that we would really like amongst our leaders as well.
I couldn't agree more. What worries me is obviously something we've touched upon already, and that is, it seems the electorates of the world don't disagree, or perhaps expect something different from their leaders to protect the core group or certain interests within a state, but certainly protect the state or America first, as they say. And within America, there's a core group within the electorate that needs to be addressed first, etc. How can we get to that problem that people might not really know what's best for them in global terms? Because you already mentioned that these leaders that are currently elected aren't particularly good at tackling the challenges, whether national or global, that we're facing today.
Well, I think that one could think about 2 routes and wonder whether one had to choose, or that really you've got to have both. And one is, obviously, it's to do in a sense with argument, in a good sense of the word, right? With the information, with the explanation, with the contextualization, with doing this in ways that are subtle and serious, but also relatively easy to understand. And I think that there, you know, one feels there are a lot of problems with the social media age, which on the one hand makes much more information so much more easily available to so many more people, and also not just information but opinion and analysis and so on, but also has seemed to provide a platform in which, you know, fake news can be promoted even more quickly and even more widely, and into which huge energy has been put. So, but nonetheless, I really do believe in trying to persuade and finding the best ways to communicate and persuade. But the second thing is to go back to that idea that, well, some of the people who are voting in ways that, frankly, I disagree with the results of their vote. I just have to say that straightforwardly. I'm sorry if they are watching and would find that patronizing, but I think they're wrong, right? So I want to persuade them to do the right thing.
Right.
Fine.
Yeah.
But I understand that many of them are thinking about completely different things from what I generally think about. And I understand that their situation in life is quite different from my own. So I think we've also got to think about social programs and economic programs, which instead of being based on abstractions about economic growth or jobs numbers in general, are actually based on really meeting people's needs and interests. And I think in general, people want to do something which is kind of interesting in life, and they want to do something which gives them a decent, a dignified, and a reasonably prosperous life. Most people are not really greedy. We'd all like some bits and pieces of the consumer culture, but we all know we can't have the whole damn lot of it. So it's basically, I think it's a more egalitarian approach to how we develop our societies. And I think that along with that, we just need to keep on winning more and more people to the idea that as that shift could be made, it would have to be done in a way which was environmentally sustainable. And that is a fundamental part of any economic strategy now. If an economic strategy is not sensitive to the environment, then it's not a long-term economic strategy, because it is destroying what it's attempting to construct. So it's just words. So it must be sensitive to the environment in order to be an effective and a fully functioning economic strategy. I think if we could work on both of those levels together, we might see kind of change.
And in a way, that's back to that greatest strategic prize of the 21st century, which isn't just an issue. It is the issue that has to be integrated in everything else we do in politics and international security then. And related to that, we have a question about the Paris Agreement and to what extent that can be effectively implemented within this current security climate and the current state of international affairs.
Oh, I don't think that there is any difficulty in doing that as far as the effect of security on it is concerned. I think that all the difficulties about fully implementing the Paris Climate Agreement are to do with changing behavior. I think that the military aspect of that is a relatively small one. And after all, military organizations are pretty disciplined. And so to the extent which it is worked out how they can change their behavior to have a smaller carbon footprint, then, once that's been agreed and the order is given, they'll do it. So I'm not worried about that part of it. And I don't think that the security issues impinge upon governments being able to fulfill their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Climate Agreement. I think the first thing is they have to make those contributions more demanding on themselves, and secondly, they have to implement them properly.
Right.
Because at the moment, if you add them all up, they're going to far exceed the target set in a bad sense. The global temperature increase will be too high compared to what is wanted in the Paris Climate Agreement. And secondly, that's only if you add the written promises up. If you look at what they're actually implementing at the moment, they're on an even worse trajectory. So that can be addressed. My problem, right, looking at the security side, is that nature is a pretty slow system. So even if we had a kind of a fantasy land decarbonization within the next 5 to 10 years, totally down to, zero emissions,
Mm-hmm.
there's an awful lot of destructive impact backed up in the natural system, which will come out, which will be destabilizing and will make things difficult, and which we need to address. And that we can only address through cooperation.
Right. Now we've had the opportunity to point fingers a bit here to tell the world leaders what they should do.
Absolutely.
But you and I, we're neither presidents nor prime ministers, but we're in leading roles anyway, and we're thinking of students as future leaders within this sector as well. What do you think we should think about when we do the little things that we do? What is it you do on a daily basis within SIPRI in order to change the world for the better within your scope of...
oh, this is so embarrassing. You're not going to ask SIPRI staff whether... No. I mean, I think that in terms of how we think about our work, first of all, we want to be transparent, productive, and accountable. So when we put out our data, we explain the basis on which we have got it, how we've made our calculations, what the methodology is. You want to disagree with us, you have the clear basis there to see what it is that we do, in which you can find out what it is you think we do wrong, and then we can have a discussion about that. Secondly, we want to put out that information in a way that reaches as many people as possible. So it needs to go out, of course, methodologically sound, but as far as possible jargon-free, using visuals, and we put it out on social media as well as in the going out through the the traditional news media, and it being available on our website and in reports and fact sheets and so on. So it is to take seriously that we have a very diverse audience. We also, although I would like to produce more translated material, we try to take that fairly seriously as well. And we produce the summary of the yearbook in several languages. We produce the yearbook itself in, I think it's 4 other languages apart from English at the moment. And some of our reports come out in Arabic or French or Spanish, depending on what the particular constituency is that they're mostly directed at. Then I think that you're also asking about how SIPRI runs. Yeah. And I think, what I want people at SIPRI who are working at SIPRI to be able to do is really fulfill as much as possible of their potential. Now, that does involve hard work. It sometimes involves discipline of a sense of, I've got to get the report done by this time. I've got to fill in the expenses sheet. I've got to do all of these things. But it also involves being open to each other, and therefore for me being open with them and to them about ideas, about possibilities, about critique, about what we get wrong, about what mistakes are, in a way that doesn't put ego at the front the whole time. Right. So I think again you come back to the question of both of humility and that as a component in being able to cooperate. One of the things which has been difficult in the last few months is that we're not seeing enough of each other at SIPRI. So people are missing each other. Right? Yeah. And in one way, there's, that when you're a leader of any kind of institution, your mind is functioning on 2 or 3 levels at once all the time. So on the one hand, people are saying, we miss the personal contact. And part of me is saying, I'm really sorry about that, and let's see what we can do. Another part of me is saying, good. Right? I'm much happier that you're missing personal contact with your colleagues than you're thinking, oh, great, I don't have to go into work and meet them. Yeah. So, I think the sense of having a community that takes some sense of some kind of pride and pleasure in each other's work and in each other's successes. And I think that then creates an environment in which when somebody comes out, here's an idea, it's possible for people to be saying, well, that's a good idea. I wonder how we could make that come true. Rather than, oh yeah, but no, I don't think so. I mean, I've worked in organizations, or at least one in particular, and wanting to try and transform it from that thing where at the photocopier or at the coffee machine, people were just pouring cold water on each other's idea. Oh, that's not the kind of thing we do here. No, that sounds good, but management will just sit on that one. Don't worry. There's no point in talking about that. And you want to create an organization or a culture in the organization where people will say, yeah, they like new ideas here. Why don't you go and, sounds pretty wild, but why don't you try it out?
Right. And that to me is something that goes for your organization. But what if we could have that climate as a nation? Openness, curiosity, and as an international society, that would resolve a lot of the problems we're talking about here today, I think.
If you think that, even with some of the familiar problems, we're trying to solve them in kind of old and stodgy and ineffective ways, then what you're asking for is innovation. And innovation capacity, I think, is an enormous asset. And to me, that gets generated out of that kind of organizational culture and then national culture and so on.
And the knowledge management capabilities that you talked about. Of course, we take these kind of issues very seriously here because we train future leaders and we think every day about how can we create the kind of qualities in our future leaders, our students here, that promote what you're talking about and have that humility, that curiosity, openness towards differences and others, that will create good leadership for organizations and nations perhaps in the future. And that's a tall order.
Yeah.
If we're successful, then we can really do good in the world. Yeah. And if we're not, then quite the opposite. And that's a...
Well, I think one of the things that people are saying about SIPRI at the moment, is that, for example, we just had this big Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, and it went very well. We couldn't anymore meet in person, so we went online, and we did it in about a month. We created a virtual forum, and it was tremendous. But I was the one who said, "Take it online."
Yeah.
Then I went off, and it's the people who do it. So if you can recruit the right people, and then set them free to do good things, you get immense results out at the other end. It's all to do with the quality of people and the quality of their working relationships and their trust in each other. That's what generates the energy and the innovation capacity.
There's just over a minute left, but one of our students reminded me of a really good question, and that is to address them really. What's your best advice for them to think about as they start their careers and within this
based on personal experience, don't plan your career. Just don't, right? Because you don't know what opportunities will come up. You will miss opportunities because you're focused on the one which fits my career plan at this point. You get awfully frustrated because at the age of 30, you haven't done what you thought you maybe should have done by then, even if you've done some interesting things. So what should you do? Well, you should do what really interests you. You should kind of, in some sense, follow your heart, your feelings, but with the head, make sure that you have the abilities and the capacities that you need in order to be able to do what you want to do. And don't be afraid of learning by doing. One of the most striking and effective individuals that I ever came across in my working life, a woman. She had a wonderful attitude. When she was given a task to do, she had one of two responses. Either her response was, I think I know how to do that, and off she'd go and do it. Or else her second response was, I don't know how to do that. Who shall I ask?
Yeah.
Right? But always it was on the basis that, I'm going to do that. And I think that just do. Don't plan, just do. Especially at this age, if you're talking about students starting out. I've given this advice before in the sort of presence of career officers at universities, and they shiver, of course. But I honestly think that planning a career is a mistake. Just get out there and do. And when you reach, I'm sort of you were very mean at the beginning. You said that I'd been doing some things for decades.
Well,
but once you've done some things for decades, you can look back and say, oh yeah, that was not a bad career.
Oh, indeed. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom from that career to our viewers and to me, our students especially. It's been a great hour. So thanks for joining us. And thank you, all of you out there who have been part of this conversation as well. We'll meet again soon.